Hi, everyone. I hope that you're having a good weekend. The purpose of this video is to discuss chapter one from the book that I had you purchase for this class. I mentioned this in an announcement on Canvas, but we are transitioning into using this book. And so if you don't have it yet, you will need the book beginning this week, meaning Monday. So again, the book is Justice by Michael Sandel. You can get it from the GBC bookstore or you can get it on Amazon. Please let me know if you have any questions. But we're beginning with chapter one, which is titled Doing the Right Thing. A reminder that you'll have a quiz at the beginning of the week on the democracy content that we had last week. You'll also have a homework assignment, and that will cover the first chapter from the Michael Sandel text. So the quiz will cover last week. The homework assignment will cover the first chapter of the Michael Sandel read. As I've always kind of said to all of you, if you guys have any questions or concerns about the class, please reach out to me in an online class. Having feedback from students about what's working and what's not working is really, really important because I don't really get to see you guys. So please, if there's any questions or concerns you have about the class itself in terms of the way things are working so far, please let me know. With that said, I'm going to move on to a discussion of the Sandel text, chapter one, which again is titled Doing the Right Thing. And I'm asking you to read pages 3 to 30. 3 to 30, so about 27 pages. And I just want to say something about this book. This book, Justice by Michael Sandel, is probably one of the most widely used texts in ethics courses, social and political philosophy courses, mostly because it's just really, really well written and really, really clear. And the author, Michael Sandel, is a very, very good writer. He's trying to make philosophy accessible to the general public, not just to students, though this book is based on a course he taught at Harvard. So, anyways, Michael Sandel is very well known in terms of trying to make philosophy more widely available to the public, not just to students taking philosophy classes in college. He's all over the world giving interviews, talking about extremely pressing ethical issues. And so I chose this book on purpose because I think it's a very easy read in terms of philosophy. I mean, some of you may have to go over some of it a few times, but I think it's very clearly written, and he helps you understand why philosophy matters to the real world, and that's kind of his goal. And so, with that said, I'm gonna just say something about. So I have some notes on Canvas already for you on chapter one of the book. But again, the title is Doing the Right Thing. And I just want to just say something about the book itself. So the title of the book is Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? And what I want to do is just talk about this concept, justice. This is going to obviously be a fundamental concept to political philosophy in general, in terms of basic philosophical concepts. We've already talked about a number of those in previous chapters. We've talked about democracy, we've talked about civil disobedience, we've talked about social contract theory. And in all of those discussions, this sort of larger overarching concept of justice was present. If you think about um, social contract theory, the reason we left the state of nature was because the state of nature did not have any justice in it, especially for Hobbes and for Locke. There was no justice. And we needed to enter into society and have a government to enforce the law so that there could be justice. Regarding civil disobedience, we were trying to figure out what makes the law just and unjust, and when does a law reach a level of injustice that we are willing to break that law in order to change it. That was civil disobedience. So justice has already been implicit and explicit throughout the various discussions we've had already. But in this, I want to just say, in this, I mean, justice in it can mean a lot of things. There is criminal justice, which is the law. There's economic justice, and that's going to have to do with a fair distribution of resources. There's moral justice, which has to do with, I mean, that it deals with a lot, but it has to do with how it has to do with the relationship between morality and the law. There's there's this the list goes on and on and on. There's environmental justice, asking questions about climate change raises questions about environmental justice. So there are all kinds of ways of thinking about justice. And in this context, he's thinking about a lot of different senses of justice at the same time. And so the concept is very broad, and it's not just going to mean one thing in um, in this book. But what you're going to see in this opening chapter is he's providing three ways of approaching questions of justice, three ways of approaching questions of justice. And he does that through looking at some case studies. And he begins by looking at a hurricane that happened in 2004. Now, this book was written in 2012, so some of his examples at this point are somewhat dated. There have been many, many more devastating hurricanes to hit Florida and Texas. This was even before Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans, which is unfortunately the most well-known hurricane in U.S. history, really. But this happened in 2004, and he wants to look at something that happens in the aftermath of this hurricane, which was named Hurricane Charlie. What happens in the aftermath is what we find are businesses raising prices on consumer products, prices for ice, prices for generators, prices for hotel rooms. You see businesses raising their prices in the aftermath of a hurricane. And some of you may be familiar with this practice. The practice is known as price gouging. And in some states, it's actually illegal to price gouge. There are actually laws against price gouging because it's considered, says right here, and I think this says it about as well as you can, it's considered an unfair exploitation of vulnerable people. Right? And but at the same time, from the business owner standpoint, the business owner is saying, look, in the context of a hurricane, um, there's going to be limited supplies, but there's going to be more demand because this is a exceptional circumstance where there's going to be more demand for our products. And so we are in a position as business owners to charge more for those products. And the question, again, basically what happens, the question is this just or unjust? Or price gouging, is price gouging a just practice? Well, from a purely economic standpoint, you could just say it's just about supply and demand. That's all that's happening here. Business owners are simply responding to the market. On the other hand, if you say this is not only about economics. It's not only about what's right according to the market. It's also just about basic fairness and basic decency. The idea that in a situation where people have lost their homes, potentially at least, that would be the worst case scenario. That, but in a situation where somebody could potentially have lost their house, you're going to now say, well, it looks like you're taking advantage of those people. And so, that's kind of the two ways of thinking about it. You've got justice in terms of, you might say, is price gouging a just practice? And you might, but then you could say, is it just to make laws against price gouging? Because what happened is that Florida basically sought to pass a law that would make it illegal for business owners to raise their prices. And so what he's trying to show you is that within this example, you can see different questions arising as it relates to questions of justice. You've got this, which is price gouging a just practice? One approach, which Sandel calls the virtue approach, well, the virtue and vice approach. Virtues and vices are basic characteristics and traits that either society should promote or they shouldn't promote, that a good society either should promote or shouldn't promote. Virtues and vices are based upon a philosopher named Aristotle, and it'll come up later in the book. I'm not going to go too far into that now, but in this case, it would seem like the question is, what would a just society do? And it seems like in this case, a just society should not be promoting this kind of behavior, which says business owners will take advantage of vulnerable populations. And so it seems like this would be promoting the vice of greed. Vices are the opposite of what we want to be promoting. Vices are the extremes. There's the virtue, and in this case, generosity would be the virtue. Greed would be the opposite of generosity. And so it seems like, from a virtue perspective, which is one of the three approaches that Sandel is discussing in this opening chapter, because those three approaches are going to form the framework for this book, it would seem to say that we should not be promoting greed in a time like a hurricane. But another approach would say that what's most important is liberty and autonomy. In other words, we should respect the business owners' autonomy to decide what they want to do with their prices. Proponents of this approach would say we should not make laws against price gouging, because then you are interfering in the market. And so what this says down here, respecting freedom, this view argues that the state, in other words, the government, in this case, the state of Florida, but not just the state of Florida, the government of Florida, should not interfere in voluntary exchange between individuals. So making laws against price gouging is not something that the government should be doing. There's a common argument about the government interfering in the economy. That would be a kind of free market approach. And the concern here would be that you're not respecting the freedom of the business owner. And then the last approach, so we've got respecting freedom, which is a liberty-based approach to justice in this case. We've got a virtue-based approach to justice, which says that we should discourage greed as a society. The last approach which is going to be known as also as utilitarian, which is the third approach to justice, which says that we should, in this case, how should we approach the question of price gouging laws? Well, we need to ask what um, what action will benefit the most people? What action will benefit the most people? And so here we have the solution, and Sandel discusses this in the reading. Proponents of the market argue that higher prices benefit the general public by encouraging suppliers to travel to the disaster zone with goods. And so, in fact, in a kind of surprising way, the welfare-based approach, the utilitarian approach, would say that by having higher prices, you're actually encouraging more suppliers to come to the disaster zone with more goods and services for these people. And so it's not the same justification. It's not saying that the higher prices should be higher because they respect uh, freedom. It's because it produces the best set of consequences. They're not asking about freedom in this case. So at the end of the day, what you see, this one example of Hurricane Charlie and the price gouging that happened as a result, it's supposed to show three approaches. You have justice as virtue, justice as utility, and justice as liberty. Again, so these are the three different approaches. In each case, what's being said is, in this case, we would want to approach questions of justice through a virtue-based lens. In this case, we'd want to approach questions of justice through a utility-based lens, or we would want to approach justice through a liberty-based lens. It's not going to be the same in every case. Sandel himself, in a lot of cases, is going to favor the virtue-based approach, but not every case will have the same response. But this is sort of the framework for this book, is using these three approaches to think about questions of justice. And so that's what this opening example of Hurricane Charlie is supposed to show. Now, there's another example. I'm not going to talk about all of these. You can read them on your own, but another example is what happened in 2008. Many people call this the Great Recession that happened in 2008, when the housing market crashed and caused the economy to crash alongside with it. And what happened in 2008, when that happened to the economy, the government had a question in front of it. They had to decide what to do, because the argument was that you could not allow these banks to fail. And so the government had to ask itself, what should we do? Now, the government ended up bailing out the banks by basically coming to their rescue and giving them this huge financial package to basically rescue them so they didn't collapse. And of course, that was the first step, and that made the public angry, because it sounded like you were giving the argument, of course, and the phrase you may have heard is that these banks are considered too big to fail. And so, because they're so large and they're so intertwined in the economy, you cannot allow them to collapse, because there would be too many unintended consequences of allowing these banks to collapse. But nonetheless, that was sort of the first thing. But then it's what happened afterwards. What was discovered is that these banks, when the money was given to them by the government, they went ahead and actually just gave themselves bonuses. And so, it kind of felt like the idea was that, well, first of all, there again, it was giving them the money in the first place. You were giving money to the banks that had defrauded these homeowners by lending money to homeowners who they knew couldn't pay back the loans. And so you basically then went and gave these banks money, And it seemed like you were basically saying, you guys messed up, but we're going to give you a bunch of money. And it seems like you were rewarding failure, right? And so, this is just another question about rewarding greed. It seemed as though that as a society, we were again rewarding greed. But a welfare-based approach again might say um, that the economy, instead of only the question isn't what virtues and vices as a society should we be promoting. The question is also, um, how can society be most benefited in a given, and this is a pretty clunky way of wording it. I'm just writing this off the top of my head, in a given situation. This is more of a welfare based approach where you're asking more, or welfare slash utility, which basically says which approach um, produces either the greatest benefit or the least harm, because sometimes there are no good options and all you can do is minimize harm. And so a welfare based approach to this question might say, yeah, it may seem like we are rewarding greed, but society as a whole, or at least will experience the least amount of harm if these banks are not allowed to fail. Now, again, it's kind of a separate question about how is it that these banks got that big, but that's kind of a separate question. That's not really the central question here. The question is um, not not why were the banks allowed to get that big. That can be dealt with later. The question is, we find ourselves in a situation where these banks are about to fail, the economy is about to collapse, and the government has to decide what to do. So they bailed out the banks because it was going to produce the most amount of good or the least amount of harm for society, even if it seemed like we were promoting greed or rewarding failure. And the virtue based approach would approach the question that way. But the welfare based approach might say, well, we can't be concerned about virtues and vices all the time. We have to ask practically, what is the least amount of harm that can be done? And it seemed like the calculation was bailing out the banks was going to benefit society the most, or at least hurt society the least. And so the welfare based approach wins out. Again, that's another question you can ask. There's a third, um, there's a third uh, example that Sandel discusses in the context of the Purple Heart, and I'm not going to go through that, but it asks questions about virtues and vices again. It tries to show you really what a virtue based approach looks like, and this is a crucial quote here. We can't decide what people deserve without first deciding what virtues or qualities or honor are worthy of honor and reward. And those words are really exemplify the virtue based approach, because what people deserve is itself a question of justice. But what Sandel is saying, there is a prior question. Before we can decide what people deserve, we need to first say, what are the virtues or qualities that are associated with the activity that we're engaged in? That's going to be a crucial part of understanding this virtue based approach. Now, um, there is more in the chapter. He introduces the trolley problem, which is probably something that a lot of you are familiar with, which is not exactly related to these three up here examples of the price gouging, the Purple Heart, and the bank bailout. This is more just an exercise in showing you how moral reasoning works. And what I think he wants to show with the trolley problem is that when we're with all of these scenarios, when we are trying to reason about what the right thing to do is, which is what the title of his book is, What's the Right Thing to Do? there's a kind of toggling between general principles and particular situations, right? This is what moral reasoning looks like, is that we have some general moral principles. The question is, in a given situation, in a particular situation, does the general principle fit? Because it's fine to have these principles in the abstract, but if you have cases where the principles don't seem to make sense, then you may have to change the principle slightly. And so you have to go back up to the principle, which is at a higher level of generality, and amend the principle for the particular situation. So, for example, in the trolley problem, somebody who approaches the trolley problem and says, we should do nothing, right? In other words, if you're familiar with the trolley problem, the basic dilemma is, do you kill one person and save five, or do you just do nothing? Most people opt, even though somebody gets killed, most people opt for killing the one person and saving five people. That's more the utilitarian approach. But those who advocate is, they might say it is wrong to take innocent life. And that might be their general principle. And so the question is, can you apply that principle in the trolley problem, that it's wrong to take innocent life? Well, if taking innocent life can result in more lives being saved, then you might say, well, that's the way we have to adapt our principle. And so this is what Sandel is trying to show, is that in all of these cases, in any case study, we're all going to have these general principles that we believe in. You know, do unto others. Um, uh, you know, what goes around comes. I mean, I'm not. I don't know what goes around comes around. Things. I mean, some have the one might makes right, and I'm not even saying you believe that. That one is not a great principle. But we have these. All of us have these general principles dealing with justice, and the question is, when a particular situation arises, can we just apply the principle, or do we have to either find a new principle or amend the principle, right? So here you might say it is wrong to take life unless doing so results in saving more lives. And so that would be adapting this original principle to the trolley problem. And that's what he's explaining in this chapter. He goes through more examples. He uses almost a real life trolley problem example. And this is a real story, and you can read about this. It's pretty fascinating when these soldiers in Afghanistan have to decide to do with these Afghan goat herders that they encounter. They have to decide whether to kill them or not. And so that is almost a real life trolley problem. Um, and so, what he says down here, and this is kind of what I've been saying, is that we start with an intuition or a judgment about a specific case. So, in other words, I present a scenario to you like price gouging. And I think a lot of us in the price gouging are going to say it's wrong. The intuition is that it's wrong. The principle is that you should not exploit disadvantaged people. So again, if we look at what Sandel is describing, you're presented with Hurricane Charlie. You find out these business owners are raising prices. The intuition seems to be that's wrong. And that might be it. It's wrong to take advantage of people. What is the principle? The principle, the more general principle that justifies the judgment, is it's wrong to take advantage of people in vulnerable circumstances. Right? But what if that principle collides with the principle that business owners should get to decide how to control their prices, and we have kind of a conflict there in the price gouging scenario between two principles, and we have to try to figure out which principle offers better reasoning. And so that's what this opening chapter is about. It's just providing you with a bunch of examples, a bunch of case studies to try to show you how moral reasoning works, of kind of toggling between a general principle and a particular situation and figuring out whether we need a new principle, or if the principle we have is good, whether we have another principle that somebody else might hold, and how to resolve a conflict between those two principles. That's what this chapter is about. But overall, it's also important to recognize three approaches: justice as virtue, justice as utility, and justice as liberty. So those are the three approaches. That kind of forms the framework for the book. And that's really all I'm going to discuss in this opening lecture. If you guys have any questions, let me know. And I hope you have a good upcoming week.